Okay, well, welcome everyone to the very final meeting of the ADUs in Denver Advisory Committee. And I know we're going to have a slightly smaller group tonight. There were some folks who couldn't join, and we're approaching the holidays and things are getting pretty crazy. But it's wonderful to see those of you who could make it. And so as people trickle in, my proposal is that while we get underway and I talk about what we're doing tonight, put in the chat what you are going to be doing 1 week from now. So it's next Thursday evening. It's going to be, hopefully some of you are wrapping up work. It's going to be Hanukkah. It's going to be a few nights before Christmas. Maybe some are traveling. So what are you going to be doing a week from now? Next Thursday evening, preparing for, I don't know, maybe cooking good things or skiing or something. Or sitting in traffic down I-70, coming back from skiing for hours. Okay, so while everyone's doing that, just a reminder in terms of what we're doing tonight. This is our last meeting. And so the city staff is planning to start off the meeting just recapping what they heard from the last meeting in November from all of you and what they've been up to since in the past month. And then we're going to go into, okay, here's the final draft, the draft strategies, the draft strategy report, and walking you through the key issues that were considered, the pros and cons for each of the major topics that went into and have been documented in the report, and then the recommendations that the city has come up with at this point. And then just have a chance for you all to ask final clarifying questions or make final suggestions or, probe a little bit on the things that the city is contemplating at this point. And that's going to be a pretty just informal discussion format. And then toward the end of the meeting, we're going to take everyone's temperature on how you're feeling about the proposals at this point, and the process. And then we'll do a wrap up with next steps, what to expect, and what's going to be happening in January. So I think, and this will be the last meeting of this particular committee. So just to clarify that too. So I think with that, are there any questions, or city staff, do you want to add anything to what I said just to clarify what we're doing tonight? Or does anyone have questions? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think that was great. Thanks for the intro.
Okay. And so I'm like watching out of the corner of my eye all the things that everyone's going to be doing in a week. I love it. Okay. Well, that sounds great. So with that, I believe I'm going to, first of all, remind folks, for members of the public who are participating, we will allow time for public comment. As always, at the end, there is a Q&A in which, as for those of you who are used to it, you can type in your questions and city staff will be responding and answering, and as relevant, bringing topics into the rest of into the advisory committee discussion as well. So folks are welcome to use the chat, but for committee members, I would just encourage you, if there's substantive things you want to share, please do say them verbally, because things can get lost in the chat. Okay, so I'm gonna, Sinead, I think you may need to allow the screen share so that the city can share the presentation, and then we'll get underway. And I believe I'm going to pass it to Elisa from the city, who's going to review what we heard at the last meeting and what you all have been up to as a city. Josh, are you able to share your presentation now? Is it working?
So you're not yet.
It should be
there we go.
working now. Okay,
Now we're in.
thanks. Sorry
All
about
right.
that.
Okay, thank you. All right, Elisa, you should be able to go ahead.
Great. So I'm just going to quickly recap what we talked about the last meeting, just so we can remember where our conversation had left off. So the main topic of last meeting was sharing this context-based approach. So at a very high level, the draft strategy includes greater allowances in the urban context where the demand for ADUs is the highest, and then the tightest allowances in the suburban context. And then we have the urban edge context, which would have a blended approach of the two, which kind of varies based on the presence of an alley. So we heard a lot of really helpful feedback last meeting, and I just want to share a couple of themes that emerged and that we've been thinking about intentionally. So first, we had some great discussion around the draft suburban context standards, particularly in the form of the proposed height and the setback requirements. So we had heard from some people that felt that these requirements still might not be flexible enough. And then we heard from other people who felt that these were necessary and important to be respectful of privacy and shading concerns in this area. And then we had also heard loud and clear that it's important to make sure that the suburban standards are distinct and reflective of the neighborhood character, because we are opening up ADUs to a new part of the city, because right now they're not allowed in most suburban districts. We also heard that the draft strategy should pay attention to incentivizing desirable outcomes, particularly in the form of making one-story ADUs easier to build, incentivizing placing ADUs more towards the center of the lot rather than the property lines at the side, and then prioritizing building housing over storing cars. And then we also had some really good conversation about some of the use allowance pieces, including owner occupancy and short-term rental. So we did hear from some that doing things like keeping the owner occupancy requirement and not allowing short-term rentals would help to avoid speculation and ensure that these new housing units are inhabited by local residents. And then lastly, I will share with you what we've been up to and how we have used your feedback between the last meeting and today. So we've been having quite a bit of internal discussion, and we've done even more Peer City research on the owner occupancy topic. We've also had some very intentional internal discussion around short-term rental. Josh has been doing some council member briefings to sharing elements of this project with them and getting their thoughts on some of the key topics that this group has identified. And then we also developed the draft strategy report that was sent out a few days ago. So all of these things have helped to inform the version of the draft strategy that you're going to see today. And we have more details to come on all of these topics.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think it's really helpful, Lisa. Thank you for just reminding us where the conversation last was and what's been happening on your end as staff. Does anyone have any questions or things that you remember or want to just note and bring into this meeting from the last, other than what was just recapped? Okay. Perfect. So Josh, I think we're going to go to you now to start walking us through the report, and starting with the issues and all the considerations that went into the draft strategies.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, actually, I'm going to hand it over to Abe for this section, but
Great. Okay. So Abe, we'll pass to you. And as we're doing that, I think in terms of elected officials, we have Councilwoman Black on this call. Is that right? I saw you, and then yes, there you are. I just wanted to acknowledge, hi. And I don't believe we have others at the moment. But I did want to just, for those of you who've just joined late, just a reminder that this is our final meeting, and we are going to hear from the city now, going through all the considerations that went into the final draft version of the report, starting with the issues and the pros and cons for each topic that were really considered and went into the final strategies. And you might notice, I don't know, you probably can't see in the chat for those of you who joined after the fact, but we asked everyone what you're going to be doing a week from now, next Thursday evening, and we got like amazing, awesome responses. So please feel free to put in what you're going to be doing. It's pretty fun to see. So go ahead, Abe, sorry, please.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, just want to acknowledge our awesome planning board chair, Joel Noble, is also here. And thank you, Joel, for staying so involved in the project and having such great feedback. I'm going to talk hopefully just for a few minutes, because this isn't going to be new information really, but just want to remind everyone, if you go on to the next slide, Josh, just about the conversation over the last few months around the issues that we identified together and the alternatives that we considered to address those issues. We had the general categories of issue like impact on neighborhoods and community, and design, construction, and buildability. And then we had these specific issues kind of down the left column there, like setbacks, building height. I'll just to kind of remind you of the thought process that led up to the draft strategy that Josh will talk about. I'll just give you a couple of examples of the issues and the alternatives discussion that we had. So if you go on to the next slide, Josh. And we know that that draft report came to you very late. Sorry about that, and many of you probably barely had a chance to even look at it, if at all. So the little each one of these slides that refers to one of the topics in the report has the page numbers of the report on there if you have an interest in following along, or if you know where to, or so you know where to go for more information. So one of the issues we talked about was setbacks, and at a really high level, there was concern that the minimum rear setbacks for detached ADUs, like in the current regulations, don't relate to the height of ADUs, they don't relate to alleys, that just doesn't make sense. So just in the realm of rear setbacks, at least, there was a consideration of like, well, especially in the suburban context, where there's a little more room for placing ADUs, increasing the rear setback from 5 to 7 feet, or maybe it should go up to 10 feet, or make the setback regulations dependent on the height of an ADU or on the existence of an alley in the context where there's sometimes an alley and sometimes not. And I think, spoiler alert, in the strategy, the draft strategy kind of proposes some combination of all of those things. So if you go on to the next one, Josh, talking about building height, and there's certainly a lot of concern that the existing 1.5 story limit in stories for detached ADUs increases the cost and complexity to build an ADU. And we talked a lot about all the issues with that and looked at models just to see how maybe you'd build a bigger ground floor or be really encouraged to build a big garage just so you could get enough habitable square footage on the second story and things like that. So that concern. Then there was concern that 1.5 stories or 2 stories or anything more than 1 stories might not work in every situation, especially on lots without alleys close to the rear of the lot. So the alternatives we work through, really kind of relate to those setbacks, height being dependent on the presence of an alley or how far away it is from neighboring lots. And then of course, with the 1.5 story height limit saying where we've, the alternative that, is really favored is don't do it. Don't use a limit of 1.5 stories. It's either 2 or it's 1. The 1.5 story thing doesn't make sense, just increases cost. So you can go on to the next slide, Josh. So bulk plane related to height very closely, as well as to setbacks, and some concern that the current bulk plane regulations wouldn't always allow a fully habitable second story on the narrowest urban and urban edge lots. So the bulk plane starts citywide right now in all districts that allow ADUs for an ADU 10 feet above the property line, and then kind of comes in at a 45-degree angle. And what that means is that by the time you're at the minimum setback for an ADU, you can't actually get the full habitable height there. When you've got a wider lot, no problem, just move the ADU a little further away. Not possible on a narrower lot. So that was the issue that we looked at, and looked at raising the bulk plane height. Could it be just 1 foot? Would that be enough? Could it be to 12 feet? Maybe just remove the bulk plane requirement altogether to address that. What lot sizes should relate to different adjustments to the bulk plane, pros and cons of all those things. And we've talked about kind of where we were landing with that too, and Josh will confirm that. He talks about the strategy. So I think we've just got a couple more, Josh. Go on to the next one. So owner occupancy, lots of discussion about this one, and we're still talking about it. This one has more alternatives listed. So this was the requirement that in order to have an ADU, you have to literally live on the property that has the ADU. That's in the code now. We talked a lot about just flat out removing that requirement. And also, more in the background have been considering other compromise alternatives that you'll see on pages 30 and 31 of that report, like removing it, but monitoring impacts annually, keeping the requirement, but only apply it at time of permitting. That's a kind of nuanced thing where you would have to be the owner to get the permit, but then the permit would run with the property, so it wouldn't be as much of an issue if you moved away, and a few other alternatives. And then I think we'll have a little bit more discussion about that when we get to the strategy part of the discussion, which is where we are. So Ryan, if you think it makes sense to me that we would maybe pause just for a moment here, and then we'll turn it over to Josh.
Yes, exactly. So I think the first question is, does anyone have any questions or thoughts regarding just everything that Abe just went through, which is also reflected in those relevant pages in the strategy report? Okay, excellent. You are so clear, and nice work, all of you, in the report. Maybe people have had a chance to look at this. So yeah, I think, Josh, go ahead and let's just keep pausing periodically for questions and thoughts and reflections as we go.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for all that information. Good job, team. But yeah, let's get to the meat of it. I guess this is what we're all here for in the end, looking at our final draft strategy recommendations. Hopefully it's not too much of a surprise to anyone. I think, we've been at this for quite a while, and we think we've struck a pretty good balance between your input and all of our focus discussions. But quickly, just looking at some of our citywide building form recommendations. As you know, we have specific context form recommendations, which we'll get into later. But then we've got a lot of the things that are just citywide recommendations that we've heard we should absolutely do. And we are currently recommending to do some of these things, like the minimum lot size requirement. Currently, we're recommending to remove that requirement citywide. We believe that we should at least allow every property to be at least ADU eligible. That doesn't mean that everyone's going to be able to practically build one on their property due to site constraints, but we should at least give people the opportunity to do a detached ADU where feasible. The other recommendation we're looking at is applying the building coverage exemption to ADUs. We've talked about this one a lot, how it currently only applies to garages today. You're allowed to exempt up to 500 square feet from your building coverage allowance. That only applies to vehicular storage at this moment, but we are recommending to apply that to ADUs, which will go a long way in hopefully seeing more single-story ADUs, as those are difficult to build today without going for that exemption through parking. All right, some of the use limitations that are important. One that we'll touch on a little bit more later is this maximum use size. We are recommending that we increase our bottom threshold of allowable ADU use from 650 square feet to 864 square feet, moving into that next tier. We've heard a lot about the potential livability or the difficulty within providing housing options within 650 square feet. And so we've heard that 864 square feet is a more feasible option and could go a long way as far as getting more 2-unit ADUs, more housing options built in some of these neighborhoods. We're looking at allowing the reuse of existing structures. We've heard how important it is to allow folks to reuse a garage where feasible. There could be, complications with building code and other issues along the way, but zoning is the first barrier that we need to clear in order to allow something like this. So when a garage is in good standing condition and meets building code, we are allowing for that structure to be converted to a habitable structure. And allow those bits to remain in place that don't meet the zoning today, but any new portion that's added on to that structure would be required to meet the current setbacks for that zone district. And lastly, we've heard that we need to allow accessory ADUs to accessory the other uses besides just single unit. So looking at allowances for ADUs to be accessory to things like duplexes and row homes. We are moving forward with recommending that in this package as well. Shall we pause here for some questions? It looks like Rosemary, you've got one already.
Rosemary, please go ahead, and then Gosha, you can go next.
So the accessory to non-single unit uses, I remember we had a discussion on that and there was some concern about what could evolve if that was allowed. So that discussion never seemed to proceed. So I'm not sure why this is put in here when it seemed to be sort of, some people had some concerns, and I'm just wondering if those of you who had concerns could repeat those. I think Ozzy, you had some concerns, and I don't know if anybody else did, but I'm just curious.
And so, thanks, Rosemary. And maybe, I don't know, Ozzy, if you want to raise your hand, or if anyone else does who remembers those issues. Yeah, and so Gosha, maybe we'll go to Ozzy, and then I don't know if you want to chime in on this same question, but go ahead, Ozzy.
Well, go ahead, go to Ozzy. I have different question.
Okay, thank you.
Ozzy, I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, I
But
mean,
you know, it's kind of those things that happen that nobody can anticipate. It's like the slot, the slot homes that evolved because of the garden court. I mean, there was some concern about what could happen.
Yeah,
down the road.
and I mean, I'm ultimately glad to see this in here as a recommendation because I feel like accessory to 2-unit is a no-brainer. And accessory to traditional row homes would be extremely compatible in neighborhoods where those occur. I think my concern was, some of the diagrams that were shown of row homes did look like, recent developments that I would have characterized as slot homes and as row homes in the neighborhoods that allow them. The thing I learned from Josh and Abe is actually those particular row home developments, which are, what I'm talking about are fourplexes where you've got 2 doors up at the street and then 2 doors that are way back from the street, but they're all kind of facing the street. Those weren't actually gotten rid of in the slot home amendment. Those are still allowed as row homes. So allowing ADUs in that context doesn't really make a difference in terms of whether that form will occur or not. That's more just an issue with how the code is written with row homes right now.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Thanks, Rosemary, and thanks, Ozzy. Gosha, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a clarification on a previous slide, please, regarding exemption, because I think the exemption now does apply to ADUs, but it's contingent on parking. So as long as 80% of the ground floor is parking, ADU would be exempt. I just want to make sure that that's what you're seeing, because it sounds like I guess it's not clear to me. So if you could clarify how the exemption will apply to a single-story ADU.
Yeah, that's right. It does apply today to an ADU that contains parking. So essentially it only applies to the parking area with an ADU above it. And so we're saying we should allow that exemption to just a single-story ADU, to just that habitable space. So no parking requirement needed in order to get that 500 square foot lot coverage.
Great, thank you.
Exemption.
That's what I thought you were saying. I just want to clarify. Thank you.
Yeah, no connection between parking and building coverage exemption. You can
Great.
just get it.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for clarifying things where it's useful to do so. All right. Any other questions before we keep moving on? Or comments? Okay. Go ahead, Josh, and people can continue to just raise hands.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much for that. So yeah, we did have another item just recently come up based on our last meeting discussion. I guess Elisa touched on this at the beginning, this idea of the maximum size for an ADU in the single unit district. We do have these use limitations in place. I think we've had an email going around throughout the committee that there was still a bit of concern that, maybe this use limitation is still possibly too limiting for ADUs. There seemed to be a bit of confusion about if someone was to build a 2-story ADU, how could the ground floor be used? And if some of that square footage needed to be non-habitable. We're not dictating, how the square footage will be cut up. I mean, it is still limited based on those use limitations. So through this recommendation, we're recommending to move to that 864 square feet as the smallest use allowance, up to 1,000 square feet based on lot size. That does mean that you could have a 2-story ADU that was 500 square footprint, ground floor 500 square feet of ADU, and an upper floor of 500 square feet. And so we're not dictating that you have to provide parking in that structure whatsoever or any non-habitable space, but the code is very clear on, what it means to be accessory. We have it clearly defined in our use limitations. Accessory is defined as being incidental, subordinate, and customary to the primary use. And so we have explored this idea of if we were able to, lift this use limitation entirely, not limit ADUs to any square footage, but that would sort of go against some of the code philosophy on the idea of accessory. And so there needs to be some limitation so that that use does not supersede the primary use. And so in this case, we're talking about a single unit dwelling. So the primary use there would be a dwelling unit, a single unit dwelling unit with an accessory use of a dwelling unit. And so if we were to allow that square footage to, be unlimited, the ADU could potentially be larger than the primary in use and things like that. And so we do have to hold these limitations in order to meet, uphold the code. And so we are, once we, just as I just mentioned, we are extending that building coverage exemption. So we are trying to incentivize the idea that you're not needing to add parking in order to get a larger ADU. And we are bumping up that last threshold from 650 to 864. And so we feel as if, we struck a pretty good balance here of getting to livable units, but also prioritizing housing over vehicles and looking for buildable units as well. Do we have any maybe thoughts on that? I think there were some folks that were chiming in with questions previously, but just want to touch in and see if that makes sense.
Josh, one thing, I guess I was just wondering, I feel like there are already cases where there are ADUs that are larger than the primary home. Are you talking just in 2-story locations? Is that what you're?
No, so yeah, so this limitation doesn't have anything to do with the existing primary. It's just the idea that if per se we were to lift this limitation and said that there was no limit to an ADU, there could be the case that the entire ADU could potentially be used as a short-term rental, and that square footage, that use could be larger. It could be, not subordinate to the primary. The property's use could be perceived as lodging versus a single unit dwelling. Does that make sense?
Chelsea, did that answer your question, or do you want to restate the question? And it looks like Gosha and Jenny have both put their hands up, so they may want to add to it too.
Yeah, maybe other people have things to add. I guess I just like that we've already seen projects where the ADU is larger. So if that is part of the concern that now the accessory is becoming the prime, I don't know. I guess I'm not sure what I'm asking. I just am a little confused by this slide.
I think we understand, right, that like this rule, like, 864 square feet or 1,000 square feet on a bigger lot for an ADU, that if you have a really small primary house, that 1,000 square foot ADU is still maybe going to be bigger than that house, or even an 864 square foot ADU. And so we haven't proposed to literally say it can never be bigger, but the allowance for your house has no limit at all. And so it's really just a kind of balance between, like, most of the time this means the ADU is going to be smaller. Certainly over time, that's probably true, because a lot of the smaller houses will get expanded, and they can be expanded a lot per code. And so this is just kind of the compromise where we've landed to keep it accessory. And it's really across all of our accessory uses, most of them are handled this way, like the amount of square footage that can be devoted to an accessory use, as opposed to saying it can never be bigger than the primary, which has some issues attached to it because can be kind of inequitable just in the sense that like the bigger a house you have, the bigger an ADU you'd get. Here, it's like, no, the ADU allowance is set. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Thanks, Chelsea, and thanks, Abe. Gosha, go ahead, and then we'll go to Jenny.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think there's a little bit of inconsistency with how you're explaining it, because there is no minimum size for the primary structure, and that's a good thing. I'm not suggesting we should, but there's no limitations on how large the primary structure is, and I also don't see subordinate as smaller. I think subordinate could mean many different things, not necessarily smaller. So I think this number is somewhat arbitrary. I mean, I understand the logic between subordinate and customary to the primary use. I'm not convinced that the arguments that you're presenting relative to the size of primary structure are convincing.
So
Go
Gosha, would you argue just in favor of there being no limit in square footage
I
limit
think
at
so,
all?
because I think the calibrating element is the land coverage, right? So the two structures are kind of conjoined and relative. So that's kind of, again, driving criteria. Whereas the square footage, I think no matter what number we come up with, is gonna feel arbitrary.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Jenny, go ahead.
I guess, and I just will say that this is the second to last day of my semester and my brain is just a little full, but I'm having trouble getting my head around the smallest maximum, like the phrasing there. Can you just say it in a different way? Because it's just not going in.
That is poor phrasing. That's just the smallest tier of ADUs. So in our smallest lot sizes, we're based on those thresholds of, currently it's 650, 864, or 1,000 square feet, depending on your lot size. And so our maximum square footage allowance, our minimum threshold tier would move to 864.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. I think it was just like sort of seeing it out of context that way that I was like, wait, what? Okay,
Right.
thank you.
I'm sure you're not the only one. Thank you. Yeah, no, you're speaking for others, I'm sure too.
Yeah, but so the square footage limitation is what, currently our code is defining these units as being accessory at this moment. So this is the mechanism we have to call them truly accessory. And so we're just trying to clarify that idea that this is what we use. This is how Denver defines, accessory in this way. Sure, it could be, perceived differently. It has nothing actually to do with what's built as the primary, but there needs to be a limit in order for it to be considered accessory to what a primary could be built as.
And we'll definitely note the comments about this and, just note them, that, there are differing opinions about how what accessory should look like or can look like. So thanks for the discussion. And, folks who are in the audience as well, who are interested in this question or this topic, feel free to make notes in the Q&A, and we certainly can come to you in the public comment if you want to address this as well. Anything else on this slide? Okay, go ahead, Josh.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay. The next one that's becoming interesting and a difficult topic for us to build a recommendation around is this idea of owner occupancy requirement. And so currently an ADU use is only allowed when the property owner lives on the site. They should continually maintain residence there in order for the ADU to exist. We've had a lot of discussion here and in other focus groups and with the public looking at surveys that generally folks do agree that the owner occupancy rule should be a bit more flexible. Folks should be able to move away from that property and still maintain an ADU if need be. They shouldn't have to potentially kick out their tenants and potentially decommission the accessory dwelling unit. But there's also, this concern that it could lead to potential speculative development in neighborhoods if we removed this requirement entirely, that potentially developers would want to buy up properties and build ADUs and have more distant landlords take over the neighborhood. I mean, it is a good thing that we are opening up more rentals. We know that there's a little bit of back and forth between, proving out the success of this. We've looked at a lot of other cities like Portland, Seattle, Los Angeles, and they're not seeing a huge influx of speculative development, but we still indicate that currently more conversation is needed. We are doing our council briefings and we're having discussions about what feels like the right thing to do politically in this environment and with our recommendation. But we're happy to open up the discussion here and see if anyone else has other thoughts about why or why not. We do have the issues that Abe went over briefly, but we can flip back to those if we want. But we'd love some discussion around the potential recommendation right now of continuing to think about this one further.
Yeah, and just acknowledging that, I mean, you'll probably remember that we certainly were heading in a direction of proposing to remove this requirement or do something to make it quite a bit more flexible. And we've just, with all the other big things in the report, we actually have made a recommendation. With this one, we've not made one. I think there's just, frankly, we have some worry that proposing to remove that requirement makes the overall package a lot less palatable for many folks. And we're trying to work through that. And just, I want to acknowledge that we've heard a lot from this group already and some diverse opinions on it. But feel free to ask any questions that you have at this point, and we're going to keep working on it.
So I see Ozzy and then Rosemary and then Gosha. So go ahead, Ozzy.
I think Gosha had hand up first.
Oh, you're so equitable. Gosha, I missed that. Go ahead. Do you want to go first?
That's okay. Thank you. I speak plenty. I don't mean to dominate the conversation. I'm totally fine taking the back seat.
We have a very nice group of people here. Ozzy, go ahead, and then Rosemary, and then Gosha. And actually, and then we'll go to Darcy after you, Ozzy, because her hand just went up.
So I wanted to ask if it's ever been considered whether this rule might be different in suburban contexts versus urban contexts. I think we heard from suburban city council people very strong concerns about getting rid of the owner occupancy requirement. I don't think there would be as many concerns in neighborhoods like mine, where, people buying properties to build ADUs to rent out to people would be like, great, we'll have more places to rent. That's where I think we would probably mostly land in Baker. So could this be context responsive in some way?
Yeah, and although you don't have single unit zoning, right? So we should make sure to put that on these slides, but like the requirement doesn't apply there already. So that's good. But I think it's a good point about like being more context sensitive with the requirement. We have heard though, some pretty serious concern in urban districts as well, not Baker specifically.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, but it is currently a use restriction. And so, yeah, it applies to single unit uses. I'm not sure how, Abe, we would extend that across zoning context as well, right? Beyond use.
Right. Well, it applies only in single unit zone districts right now. And so right now, if you had a single unit house in Baker, which has 2-unit zoning and some row house zoning, you actually could build an ADU and it's not subject to this requirement, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay. So Darcy, I see your hand up, and then we'll go to Rosemary and then Gosha and Councilwoman Black.
Hi, thank you. One of my questions was that there are several trusts, family trusts that own homes in our neighborhood. And there's no one individual that may own the property. So how would you be able to monitor that or control that if it was a trust that owns the property? And also, there are a lot of corporations that have bought single family homes in our neighborhood. I mean, corporations could be multiple people.
Yeah.
That's a really good question and does kind of point to how difficult any kind of enforcement is with something like this.
Well, I'm one with like Ozzy said, if it could be specific to neighborhoods, because I think my neighborhood wouldn't mind having an owner not living on the property, but still maintaining the ownership of the property and making sure that everything's taken care of. Thanks. That was my comment.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, Rosemary, go ahead.
First of all, I'd just like to repeat that I know that District 6 Councilman Paul Cashman is also very concerned about this. He has urban and urban edge zone districts. And then I had a few comments also. I looked at the peer city and research, and to me, it looks pretty skimpy. I mean, it seems it's sort of, there isn't specific data. It seems like there aren't really numbers shown there. So that really doesn't sway me toward taking it away. And then some of the options that were discussed, the one in particular that I was going to ask if you could walk us through exactly how that would work, is it would only happen at permitting time. So how walk us through that scenario, because that was one of those proposals, to either have it let's see, remove it and then have annual reporting for 3 to 5 years. And in my experience with city things that have required those kinds of reviews, it just doesn't work very well. It kind of doesn't happen. So the maintaining the owner occupancy requirement, but only at time of permitting. So could you walk us through that scenario? What would that look like?
Yep, and I think Josh has pulled it up here on the screen too.
Yeah, definitely good questions. Yeah, I mean, first on the research, it's, yeah, unfortunately very difficult to pull hard data on some of these numbers. You know, it's hard. The city itself, Denver, we just started their renter registration process, just this year. And so we don't even have good data on how many rentals we have in our own city, regardless of ADU to unit, et cetera. It's difficult. So yeah, a lot of that data is pulled from just talking to some of the professionals, some of the experts in those cities, and looking at how many rentals have come on the market since removing this. Portland's only at like what, 3% of their housing stock being rental units that are ADU eligible. And so that gives you some sense, but the idea of applying it at permit would hopefully prevent the idea that speculative developers like a corporation wouldn't be able to buy up a property and build an ADU on it unless they owner occupied it while they actually got the permit and while they built the ADU. And so it would allow folks like only owner occupiers to actually construct the ADU. But then once it's built and CO, it's occupied, once an occupancy permit is in place, they could then not occupy the property potentially or sell it off and things like that to someone that wouldn't. And so it would get the dwelling unit built and relieve some of the burden of the enforcement that we would have to do. And you wouldn't have to decommission a unit. You wouldn't have to kick a tenant out. They would ideally be able to stay in that unit if the owner had to move away.
Thanks, Josh. Hopefully that clarifies some of the question, Rosemary, and maybe we can come back if you have further clarification questions, but I think Councilwoman Black and who else had their hand up? Gosha. Do you all want to go ahead with your questions or comments?
Yeah, I was really just going to say what Rosemary said about Councilman Cashman. He is particularly concerned about these corporations, I think Darcy mentioned them too, that are buying up thousands of properties across the country. You know, it's been all over the media, and it is something that he is very, very concerned with. So I'm supportive of this group not recommending on that, just so there can be further discussion and a deeper understanding of the impacts of that. I think politically, it would be something that could jeopardize the work of this committee. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks for that.
So Gosha, I see your hand is up, and Darcy,
Yeah.
we'll go back after Gosha.
Yes, so I want to layer on that because last time we talked about it, I think there was really strong, compelling argument for allowing lifting that requirement for owner occupancy for sake of affordability. So I would like to propose that we consider it for properties that are either deed districted or in a land trust, where, you know, there's definitely control in terms of who can own those properties, because the owners have to qualify and income qualify, and that may increase supply or add some flexibility in terms of supply of affordable housing, but it kind of prevents the concern for corporate ownership coming in and buying out properties.
Great suggestion, Gosha, and it's not one of these alternatives, is it? And just so I understand it, it's so it wouldn't be opening it up very widely, but it's just making an exception when there's an actual deed restriction on the ADU to say that actually this rule doesn't apply to it.
Yeah, I think it's either deed restriction or land trust, right? Like the habitat. I don't know if Chelsea is on the call, but if the property is some kind of income restricted, that allowing that restriction to lift, and I hope that that's politically palatable, because again, it really only allows it in very specific situations and in a low income situation.
Thanks for the brain trust of this group and thinking about nuanced and creative ideas here. Okay, Darcy, I saw your hand went down, but Gabe's went up. So Gabe, let's go to you, and then we'll see if others want to put their hands up.
Okay. Yeah, this could, to me, this topic is just real complicated, but I do want to say that I think you guys have done reasonable research and steps to have, taken from other peer cities and states for this data. Granted, it may not be, the most in-depth, but, some of the things too, to me, like one of the sentences in there, you said that an environmental study preceding the decision determined that removing the requirement wouldn't increase speculation, as it would discourage demolishing existing single unit homes prior to redevelopment. Instead, incentivizing homeowners to maintain the existing housing stock while building ADUs. And I think that's an important concept, because people would, maybe corporations or speculative buyers would say, hey, let's just demolish the existing structure and put up a large McMansion, versus hey, let's put in an ADU. So like I said, it could get complicated, but I do like that you said, you also got some samples from Fort Collins, Littleton, and Salida, and they don't regulate the occupancy for any of the ADUs. And I think that's kind of a good measurement for here in Colorado. So I appreciate you getting that information. Also with Colorado Springs and Lakewood, that require owner occupancy in attached ADUs, but not detached ADUs. So it seems like there's still going to be some flexibility that needs to be done, but overall, it seems like the concept of owner occupancy is just complicated, but I just don't see it being something that should be deterring that ADU requirement or the owner occupancy requirement. So I'm kind of in favor of definitely having it more flexible and possibly be removing it. So, and I didn't have that opinion at first, but with all this other data, it's kind of swaying me to look at that option.
Thanks, Gabe. Thanks for just the thoughtful comment and just the acknowledgement of the complexity and the research that's been done and the nuance, and just your feelings at this point about it. Anyone else on this topic? It's, my guess is the city, I don't know, staff, do you want to say anything more at this point? It sounds like this is definitely being closely considered and thought about, and everyone acknowledges not wanting to see speculation, and wanting to remove barriers where possible, and just knowing it's a complex issue.
Yeah, I think that covers it all really well. Yeah.
Okay, Rosemary, maybe we'll go to you before we move topics. I see your hands up.
Hope you're still muted, Rosemary.
I'm
There you
sorry. So I just saw a comment from somebody who's watching, who's not part of this committee. And the comment was, this seems to be a solution in search of a problem. And I kind of had the same question, like what is motivating this discussion? I mean, what problems have there been? Have there been ADUs that have been forced to be decommissioned? I mean, so what prompted this? That's kind of, I think, what the person in the question and answer was trying to ask, the same kind of question.
Thank you. Staff or committee members who have a sense of this, you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe some committee members could chime in that they, brought it up as an issue, because we certainly heard it, from committee members and from some members of the public thinking like, oh, this is just a strange requirement. It's hard to understand. It kind of reduces predictability. In terms of like, is it a solution in search of a problem? Well, yeah, I mean, to some extent, the problem is a little bit hypothetical, because the enforcement is not proactive and is just complaint-based. There are only a few cases in which an owner has actually, received complaints because they weren't living there and had to decommission the ADU. So that's not a widespread thing. However, we've heard that it may be dissuading people from building one because they're just worried about it constraining their options in the future. Like, what if they have to move away? To stay legal, they would have to decommission it. And but anyone else that can chime in would be great.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest issue we get, is people that come in wanting to build an ADU, and then they learn about the rule and they're like, well, I might actually move across the country in 5 years, and maybe I won't reinvest in my property. I'm not going to spend $300,000 if, I'm forced to sell it, or the market takes a dip and I have to sell it in an inopportune time, or who knows. There's just that unpredictability there. And so it does deter some folks from actually reinvesting.
Okay.
Or, we get the other side of it where some folks are like, hey, I just inherited this house across town and I'd love to add an ADU to it. I'd love to add another rental unit. And we're like, you can't do that unless you move into that house. And so there's opportunity out there that, we're not, housing units we're not actually seeing due to the restrictions.
Okay.
Josh, do you know exactly how many times the decommissioning has had to happen? I know it's only a few. Do you have an exact number just in the question and answer or some?
No, I've heard of
that.
Just only a handful of times, I think.
Well, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Jeff Baker, who's in builds ADUs, was saying that many of their inquiries on ADUs stop dead when they hear about the owner occupancy rule. Just an indication that people may kind of fear what impact it could have in the future.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a number of you that would like to see this removed, as well as those concerns that have been voiced about about, well, what, not removing it. So I think duly noted, all of this will be duly noted, including some of the suggestions and ideas that aren't reflected on the slide, but came out of this discussion. So we'll certainly reflect all that. I want to make sure we have time for the other topics, but is there anyone else who just wants to say something on this before we keep moving? Okay.
No, I think it's just important to remember that, yeah, this only applies in single unit. And so you can do this in places like row home districts or 2-unit districts today. And, those districts are not being bought out by developers just to add to ADUs. The ADU is not really a great quick flip investment. It's more of a long-term holding. And so we are seeing majority of the builders, people that do them, are investing in their property long-term, and it's only deterring more people from doing that in a lot of cases.
Thanks, Josh. And I see Sarah, your hand just went up. So let's go to you before we move.
Okay, sorry, I just have a quick question, Ryan. So just, I think there was some verbiage in here saying that obviously more discussion on this needs to happen before we move forward. With this being the last committee meeting, what does that look like? Does that mean that the city staff is going to make a decision on how to move forward, or does this get tabled until 5, 6, 10 years down the road when we form the next ADU advisory committee?
Thanks, Sarah. That's a great question.
Yeah, how I would describe it is, so we're having some discussion now. This is actually really helpful, especially for working on, potentially some compromise solutions, which could be helpful. A lot of what's going to be important right now is to talk to elected officials and hear about their resident concerns and work through it so that we have a good understanding of, to what extent does any proposal on this issue impact the overall package here, which we know this package is very important to advance citywide objectives for ADUs. And so we want to make sure that it actually can be adopted by City Council, as Councilwoman Black said. So those discussions are going to be really important at this point. We then, staff, we will make a proposal on it. The proposal could be to simply keep the requirement or some compromise option, for example. When we make that proposal, that'll still be in like the final strategy report. And so there'll still be time for committee members or the public or others to comment on it and argue that it's the wrong proposal, for example. And so it is possible that it could change again before the final zoning is drafted.
Thanks, Abe.
Yeah, all good thoughts.
Okay.
All right.
right.
Well,
Yep, go ahead.
yeah, let's jump into some of these context discussions. So we'll start off with the urban context recommendations. You guys can follow through in the strategy report on pages 36 and 37, which we've sent out to you this week, but we've heard in the urban context that, what we should be doing is allowing for a full 2 stories, getting rid of that 1.5 rule as discussed. We've also heard that we still have the need for some flexibility on our smallest, most narrow lots, specifically those lots that are less than 40 feet in width. It's difficult to get to that habitable square footage of ADU use and design complications. And so hopefully some of these recommendations don't really come as a surprise, but looking at the table, we are allowing that 2 full stories up to 24 feet. 24 feet is the current height limit today, but making sure that that full second floor can be habitable, 100% of that footprint. We were looking at modifying the bulk plane specifically on those small lots. So the narrowest lots, those that are 40 foot less or less in width, we will be recommending to add 2 feet to the bulk plane starting height in order to sort of allow a little bit more head height and make sure that second floor can be habitable. You don't run into that issue on our wider lots, as you are able to slide the ADU, the detached form, to the center of the lot and get a full head height. And so we only need to look at changing that standard on the small lots. We are looking at keeping the rear setback at 5 feet when a garage door is present, but moving down to a 0-foot setback where feasible if no garage door is present. This should help out with those single-story ADUs, have a little bit more space, create a little bit more room in the backyard and separation between the two structures. We're looking at reducing the side setbacks just for those smallest lots. Right now, a 25-foot wide lot is allowed to have a 3-foot setback. We're looking at just extending that to up to a 40-foot wide lot. So just our narrowest lots would get that relief along with the bulk plane that would allow for more habitable structures, especially whenever you're also trying to provide parking within those detached ADUs, as it is a narrow urban lot. All of our other lot sizes stay the same at 5-foot setbacks. And then we are introducing some newer design elements that we'll take a look at. We're looking at recommending a small balcony allowance of up to 35 square feet. Only when an alley is present though. And so this is the idea of typically this structure is trying to accommodate parking. And so you may want to enter it from the exterior of the ADU. And there's issues with stairwell landings as far as not having a balcony, not having space up there. We'll take a look at what that means. But we've also heard that we should allow dormers to be able to pierce and penetrate the bulk plane where need be. It adds to some of the architectural character and can often fit in better with the context if it matches the dormer look of the primary home. Just quickly glancing at one of the design elements here. So today, currently there's no balcony allowance in the rear of the lot whatsoever. We do have ADU builds where folks have, exterior entrances, and since there's not an allowance today, a stair landing can only be up to 3 by 3, 9 square feet, just enough room to actually open the door. But if you drop your keys, they're going out into the alley. There's not a lot of space there to step aside or put down groceries or anything like that. So we've heard that there is potentially this need for a little bit more space, a little bit more breathing room as a balcony, and potentially to allow some folks that need a little bit of outdoor space to have some. And so here's what a potential 35 square foot balcony allowance could look like. Just thinking about it dimensionally, it's about 5 by 7, which, is the size of like an area rug for a lot of folks. It's not a gigantic party deck by any means, but we think a little bit of breathing room, a little bit of allowance could be beneficial. They also would not be allowed to be in the side setbacks. And so thinking about this idea of privacy, they would not be allowed to encroach into the side setback. You wouldn't be allowed to peer over your neighbor's yard that closely. You would have to match where a structure could be built today. And so more likely to see them at the front or the rear of the ADU in some sort of orientation like this. We can quickly chat about these standards or hear any thoughts that anybody might have before moving on to the next context.
So before we move to the next neighborhood context, Ozzy, go ahead, and then Darcy.
So really excited to see this. I love most of what we're seeing here. I think the extra bulk plane will allow, like for instance, ADUs on narrow lots to actually reach their maximum height, which isn't possible under the current bulk planes at sometimes. And the extra flexibility in setbacks and dormers, and it will just do a lot towards making it more possible to do practical and livable ADUs and to respond to site conditions. The balcony allowance, I'm somewhat excited about that because it reflects the discussion that we had in the architectural focus group. But if I remember, the architectural focus group was advocating for balconies specifically in a rear-facing condition, and when an alley is present, because in that case, you're facing an alley, you're not compromising the neighbor's privacy. The neighbors tend to have fences and garages that are protecting their privacy. And I am concerned that the code as written right now is going to, or well, as being proposed here, is going to incentivize the creation of exterior stairs and balconies, which aren't really a good thing in Denver's climate. I mean, there are people who do them, but I don't think they're a great idea. Especially if it's allowed in the rear setback like this, as seems to be shown in this diagram. I feel like it ends up being an incentivization for a construction approach that isn't that great for life safety and usability. So I would love to see it as just a 35 square foot allowance for a rear facing balcony that is still within the setbacks. That might be how I would suggest modifying what you're showing here. But then that's a very nuanced thing. And generally, I think it will be so good for ADU development to adopt the changes being described overall.
Ozzy, I think that's a really, we were thinking about like, how can we really make this about those rear facing balconies that are on an alley? And it seems fairly simple to say, if it's in basically in the rear 5 feet there, then that's where it's allowed.
There's a question also in the chat. Well, first of all, I will say there's a couple of just echoings of what Ozzy said, just in terms of this being extremely helpful for folks. Naomi had a question about whether the stairs, landings, and balconies are considered part of the habitable space.
We do not know. It'd have to be enclosed conditioned space to count. So
Okay.
we do see some folks, building those today in order to get a little bit more, potentially squeeze them amount of square footage as they can out of their unit.
Okay, thank you. And then Darcy has a question as well, or a comment. Darcy, go ahead.
I do, and I am really excited to see finally that there will be some type of deck, not necessarily with a design like this, but the mere fact that you can have a deck. I designed, or not necessarily design, but helped design, build a project on the anticipation that we will be able to have a deck at the rear setback like that. And so now all they're going to be waiting for is a go ahead to knock down the wall that they have and put it out there. So I'm really excited to see it. And I think it's a great ad.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, well, just to make sure we have enough time here, I'm going to suggest we move to Urban Edge. And I'll watch for hands up or comments as well at the same time.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for noticing our budget architect we had to use here, Darcy, on that balcony design. Urban Edge context. We know this is a unique context that has a little bit of urban flavor, a little bit of suburban flavor. And so we've gone back and forth on the recommendations here, and with your help and guidance elsewhere, we've heard that, 2 stories may be appropriate, especially where alleys are located, more of those urban feeling lots. Potentially only 1 story without alleys, maybe an allowance for 2 stories where setbacks could be greater. We do have some narrow lots as well in some of our neighborhoods that do need some flexibility, similar to the urban allowances. And so we do have different rules here in the table for when an alley is present and when an alley is not. And so without an alley, we're proposing that you're allowed to do a 1-story at 5 feet setback. You would also be allowed to do a 2-story if it was setback 12 feet from the rear property line. When there is an alley, you would follow the same rules as the urban allowance, 2 stories, 5-foot setback. Similar understanding of the narrow lot condition, which is, it's pretty rare in this context. I think there's only like 2,000 lots that are less than 40 foot wide in mostly concentrated in Globeville, Elyria, Swansea, but we're looking at increasing the bulk plane there, allowing for greater head height, allowing for that feasibility, make sure these units can be built in these neighborhoods. And similarly with the side setback, allowing for 3-foot side setback on our narrowest lots. We do have those varying rear setbacks for 1-story versus 2-story. So difference there in height and impact to neighbors. And we would also allow those sort of design elements to occur here, balconies where alleys are present, and dormers to also penetrate the bulk plane where needed. So a quick glance at just some examples of those and what the impact might look like on these lot conditions. So larger lots, probably more likely to see single-story builds, especially where there aren't alleys, but we do think that some properties may need some flexibility for a potential two-story alternative. And so we felt as if a decent compromise was to allow that to be in existence, create an allowance for that, as long as that setback felt appropriate. And so providing that 12-foot rear setback for a two-story ADU is what we're currently recommending.
Okay, great. Are there any, so Naomi, I see your hand up, and then Rosemary, and then Gosha. Okay, Naomi, go ahead.
Thanks so much. I apologize, I have my camera off right now. And I also apologize, I might have asked this before, but I just wanted to be reminded of the thoughts. So in the scenario where you want to build a two-story ADU and you have no alley and you're required to do that 12-foot setback, is there, or was there a discussion of this, if this would push a possible ADU design too close to the primary structure to the point where it wouldn't be able to qualify for the building coverage exemption, which requires unobstructed 15 feet between the ADU and the primary structure?
Yeah, that's right. That's a good question. I mean, it is, every lot configuration is a little bit different, right? But yeah, it is a consideration, and the idea being that you would only have to do that 15-foot separation if you were going for that lot coverage exemption, right? It wouldn't be necessary if you didn't need the exemption. So maybe your lot coverage isn't near that amount. And so we're trying to balance that idea of lot coverage versus open space and make sure that yards are appropriate. But it's a good consideration to think about. The example here at the bottom, it's a 100-foot depth lot. So it is one of our, less deep, more of a shallow lot. And we do have at least 15 feet of spacing between those two. And so it takes a little bit of design configuration. Maybe you get a longer, skinnier ADU. It's, it all depends on the potential outcome, but
yeah,
we haven't seen it as a specific barrier yet. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I was wondering kind of what, I'm sure you guys have discussed that. I was like, I wonder, because ultimately there are still options, right? Like if for some reason, due to your lot configuration, doing that exact scenario wouldn't be feasible, you could build a one-story ADU and have it located further away. Like there's probably some other option that would work for it. But yeah, thanks for just speaking to that for a moment, because it's just something that I thought when I saw that increased setback.
Correct. Yeah, it's a good thought. We're definitely going for, creating that flexibility for this unique sort of context.
Okay. Now I can't remember who was next. Gosha, did I say you're next, and then Rosemary, or vice versa? Whoever, whichever of you, feel free to go next.
Go for
I'll
it.
go. So I'm trying to wrap my head around the 2-story versus 1-story, because right now we do allow 1.5 stories, right? That's just a standard allowance across all contexts. So I wonder, and also trying to understand like the construction without the alley, and I understand the privacy separation related to the alley, but I'm trying to understand currently under current zoning code that allows 1.5 stories in this context, regardless from the alley. Like, what are the concerns? What are the actual implementation? What is the actual implementation of these forms, and like why wouldn't we keep the existing allowance of 1.5 stories?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, through this committee and through council discussions and further discussions about more ADUs coming online, we really haven't seen that many 2-story ADUs, 1.5 stories, built on properties without alleys. And so through these, further discussion, we're hearing that concern about privacy, thinking more about the current allowance being too much if there's a property without an alley? Is that actually infringing on the neighbor's privacy? Is it impacting shadows too greatly? And so I think we've come up with sort of compromise of creating a flexible option here between 2 stories or 1 story. You know, the 1.5 story just complicates construction and things otherwise. And so we felt that this was a decent balance of balancing those concerns, privacy issues, impacts, but also creating flexibility.
Yeah, and I guess the question is if they aren't built right now, the 2-story ADUs in this context without the alley, they're probably not likely to be built in the future. So are we doing ourselves kind of a disservice by limiting that entitlement that, you know, potentially, you know, not today, but maybe 10 years from now could actually result in more housing? So I don't know, I don't know that I have a definite answer. Again, without seeing enough of this type of development, it's kind of hard. I think we're trying to kind of solve a problem out of fear that maybe doesn't exist. And I'm just trying not to go down that path if we can avoid it.
And Rosemary or Councilman Black may be able to speak to some of the discussions around, you know, why there's just this sensitivity around height in the rear when there's not an alley, just having been part of those discussions. I think it's true, Gosha, that, you know, and Josh was saying, like, it's not actually happening. And if the rules were changed in this way, then it won't be allowed to happen in the future, but just to address those concerns.
And Rosemary, I see your hand was up, and Councilwoman Black's hand went up, and Naomi, your hand may have gone up again. So go ahead, Rosemary.
Well, I have a question about the dormers and also the 2 stories, how, and just from the architects on the committee, I'm wondering if it's more difficult to put windows in a 1.5 story versus a 2 story. I guess I'm asking, with the 2 story ADU, does that incentivize the placement of windows on the side looking into the neighbor's yard? And is there a way of mitigating that, like requiring them to be a certain size or making them be clerestory windows or something like that? And then with the dormers, is there any kind of design review down the road to dictate the configuration of the dormers and their placement and things like that? Because right now it just says dormers, so, you know.
Yeah, okay. Staff, thoughts about those questions?
Do you want me to take the dormer question, Josh, which is, well, and maybe you can provide specifics, but we'd actually assumed that we would build the dormer exception on one that's currently available in the Potter Highlands conservation overlay. And it does specify exactly how wide they can be, exactly how tall they can be, that they, how far they have to be inset from the building wall. And so there's like really specific rules so that it's not just one big dormer, for example, at the side.
So would that be a similar process? I mean, with dormers, if somebody wants to build an ADU in Denver, they would go through essentially a design review process.
It's not design review specifically. They're actual specific zoning rules about the maximum dimension for the width of the dormer and things like that, just like there are rules about setbacks and height.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, we can send you that relevant code section that defines dormers and scale and things like that.
If Rosemary, will you follow up with staff if you'd like to be directed to that? And I want to keep us moving just because I know we have some slides still to get to, but Councilwoman Black, go ahead.
I was just going to respond to what the question about setbacks. And I can't really speak about Urban Edge because I was here as a representative for suburban, but you know, the purpose of this is to remove barriers and make it so we can get ADUs in more parts of our city. And one of the things that people who live in suburban neighborhoods are concerned about is having a building just on the other side of their fence. And so I know some of you more urban people probably don't like that, but if we have a recommendation that is not palatable to our constituents, it won't pass. And so people who live in suburban neighborhoods would feel more comfortable if there was a wider setback. And if you compare it to the size of an alley, you know, it's more comparable. So that's where that came from.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the added context. Josh, do you want to add anything more to this, or should we move to suburban?
I think that's all good insight. I think just the one question Rosemary had about the 2-story. I think in previous discussions and with the architects, you know, it comes down to where that roof line ends. And so we're seeing less windows on the sides, you know, because of that roof line. The dormer does allow potentially a window there, but the placement is usually higher and it's not, you know, at eye level as much from what we've understood. And so, yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
But yeah, thanks for all those thoughts. I think, you know, hopefully we're striking a good balance of everyone's concerns here as we're moving through. So the final context is the suburban context. And so we've heard loud and clearly, as Councilwoman Black just mentioned, that there is the sensitivities around this context, folks that are worried about a house being a couple of feet from their back fence. 1-story seems to be the potential answer here, as long as the setbacks are appropriate. And so we're saying that a 1-story ADU that's set back 10 feet away from the rear property line feels to be the appropriate size and scale for this context. We did look at also creating an allowance for a 2-story structure if it fits within the primary building envelope. And so that is to say, what you can build as a primary structure today could take the place of the ADU that would be 20 feet from the rear property line. You could also build that as an attached ADU if you wanted to. But the bulk plane stays the same here. It's lower slung in this context. No need to increase the height if we're mostly going to see single stories anyway. Rear setback, as I mentioned, 10 foot for a single story, 20 feet for a 2-story, which we think would be a rare scenario that it gets built. There's really, the allowances here are so great, 1,000 square foot footprint for an ADU. There's really no need to go to 2 stories in this context. There's no need to park underneath it and things like that. But we are looking at side setbacks that would match the primary structure. And so 7.5 feet is basically the standard for this context, but there are some small lots that could go lower. Here's an example of what that might look like. Of course, we're not seeing all of our suburban homes built this big, so we've got some other examples here of a more modest, what you would see in this suburban context today. So 17 feet tall, single story ADU with a 10-foot rear setback. And then the potential 2-story option, which would be 20 feet away and would fall within that existing primary building envelope allowance. And so the ADU could, you know, this whole thing could be demolished and be one big building that was that far back, but we think there should be some flexibility here if someone were to want to pursue this route. Any questions on this context and where we've landed? Did we strike that balance that we were looking for?
Comments or questions about this piece? I know we've talked about it quite a bit in previous meetings, so a lot's gone into this, but Councilwoman Black, yeah, please go ahead.
I am comfortable with this and I appreciate you compromising and listening. And as I've said in multiple meetings, I think this is a great way to get our foot in the door and get people more comfortable. And, you know, anything we pass can always be changed in the future, but it's such a big change for people. I just think it's really important to get our foot in the door. So I appreciate all of the discussions we have had. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you. Let's see. I see Gosha, you raised your hand too. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So I actually have a question to Councilwoman Black. Do you think that these rules will actually result in creation of ADUs, or are these rules designed to actually prevent ADUs from being built?
I think they will result in some being built. We had an application for a waiver in a suburban zone district. I've talked about it before, but it was unanimously voted down by council. And half the people on council voted it down because they didn't like waivers, and the other half voted it down because they wanted to see some standards. And Paul Cashman and Kevin Flynn and Stacy Gilmore were three of those people who all have suburban zone districts in their zone or in their council districts. And I think once they are comfortable with these, then they will vote for them if people come forward with a rezoning. And I personally, as far as the way, I wasn't one of the people who didn't like the waiver. So if I had these recommendations, I would have voted for that.
So
And
do
I
you
al-
think that, yeah, thank you for that. So do you think under this scenario or these proposed new regulations, do you think it's going to be easier to build ADUs, and possibly the proposal that was in front of you could have been implemented realistically with the zone lots, limitations, the sizes of the zone lots, the context, it can actually be built?
Yes, I do. One of the problems is, though, there's only one zone district in suburban where they're currently allowed. So that will have to be changed, or they'll all
Right.
have to be done with waivers.
Yeah,
but
I
there
understand there's no mapping. We're not implementing it in mapping right now. We're
Right.
just creating zone districts. But do you think if somebody was to apply for rezoning to one of these zone districts, they actually are practical in a sense that they can be implemented?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
that's great.
Just to clarify for everyone, I think Josh probably already said this too. It like we'll propose to create new zone districts for suburban, but just not map them. Otherwise, we'd have no place to put these standards. Like the zone districts don't exist yet, and then ideally that creates a set of workable standards for individual property owners to rezone to, or potentially a council member to propose a larger scale legislative rezoning for a neighborhood.
Great. Thank you for the exchange and for clarifying that. Josh, was this the last slide? Was there one more for suburban, or is that it?
No, I think, yeah, we're on to our wrap-up activities.
Well, I think first I just wanted to say that I personally really appreciate this conversation, that in some cases, I mean, first of all, a lot of thoughtful questions and clarifications and suggestions in some cases where alternatives are still being considered. And knowing that, some of this is for the benefit of staff, and in many cases, you all are ambassadors to your networks and your constituents and your neighborhoods. And so having you all understand this, feel supportive of it, feel like you've, been able to just get more into the weeds on it, I think is really important, and to be able to provide this input. So we'll make sure it's all captured. So any final comments or questions on what was just presented before we do a little stepping back and taking everyone's temperature on how they're feeling about this, the outcomes and also the process, before we talk about what happens next? We covered it. Okay, so what we're going to do now is put a link in the chat. We've done this before, just to, again, take your temperature on a couple of things. But really the questions for you all are, what ADU changes are you happiest to see coming out of this process? Whether it's one or a couple of them. The second question is, going forward, what are any changes that you'd like to see further considered? So in some cases, it will relate back directly to some ideas that were discussed tonight. And then lastly, what's one thing you've appreciated about or learned from this process? And from, you know, this experience with each other. So those are the questions. I'm going to put a link in the chat. Note that for a couple of them, your word limits are very small just because of how Mentimeter is. So you should be able to just take the poll. I'm going to just give everyone a couple of minutes to complete it. If you have technical difficulties, and you can do it on your phone or you can do it on your computer, text or put a note in the chat for me or for Sinead Tally, and we'll try to help you. If something is awry, feel free to just say it verbally too. I'm just going to give you all a couple of minutes to do this, and then we'll share the results and just kind of go through them and look at what folks have said. These are all anonymous. And for folks who are listening in the audience of the webinar, feel free to just continue with any questions in the Q&A while we do this, but you'll be able to see the results too from the committee members. Okay, I'm seeing on my end, and I'll share this in a few minutes when people are ready, but a lot of you have answered the first question, and some of you are moved on to the second question.
Could you repeat the questions again? Sorry.
Yeah, don't be sorry. Thank you. Yeah, the first question is, what ADU changes are you happiest to see coming out of this process? The second is, going forward, what ADU changes, if any, would you still like to see further considered? And then lastly, on the process, what's something you've appreciated or learned from participating on the committee? Okay. Great. So I'm going to give everyone about 30 more seconds to complete this, and then I'll screen share what I'm seeing on the results side. Okay. All right. I am going to go ahead and share my screen so you all can see. Can everyone see this first question? What ADU changes are you happiest to see?
Looks good, yeah.
Coming out of this? So it's interesting because, you know, oftentimes there'll be words amplified if they're repeated a lot, but for some reason I don't see that happening. But anyway, I think everyone should be able to see this, but we'll capture this in the notes. So it'll be on the website. You'll be able to kind of study this if you're interested or talking to others about what people really were happiest to see come out of this. But everything from owner occupancy discussions to potential balconies, but flexibility, options, two-story option, fewer barriers, more housing. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next one. So going forward, what additional considerations would you like to, or ideas would you like to see further considered? So owner occupancy, incentivizing renting these to low-income folks, further discussion of owner occupancy is needed, pre-approved plans. Quite a few of these are on owner occupancy, use restrictions, a good compromise for owner occupancy again, larger decks, removing, right, owner occupancy, that's so interesting. More tax incentives for lower income homeowners, allows sales of ADUs, removal of occupancy rule. Let me just keep scrolling down. Smaller garages, more livable space. ADU form for duplex row home sites, so multiple ADUs can be adjoined. And then lastly, reduce cost, maybe a grant program to help folks qualified property owners get through the process with reduced costs. Okay, great. And then I'm gonna, let's see, go to the next one. What's something you've appreciated or learned from being on the committee? Respectfulness, open-mindedness, clear staff expectations, smart people, thoughtfulness, great minds, the discussions, all the work staff has done, sincerity, wonderful use of graphics, attentive participants, community involvement, diversity, architects, collaborative city staff, organization. So this is really lovely. I would so echo so much of this. So I think what I would love to do is just see if anyone wants to call attention. I'm going to just stop sharing so you can see each other's faces. And I can screen share any of that again, and I will make sure that you're able to see the results in the survey. But does anyone want to comment on any of those? I think, first of all, I think we've probably covered the things that people are happiest about, but is there anything anyone just wants to emphasize that we haven't talked about that you're really happy about in terms of outcomes? I think that we've covered that one. And likewise, I think we've covered things that you would like to see, additional considerations, but anything you want to say about the process that you've appreciated or learned that you saw in that list or didn't see in that list before we close here? Okay. Yeah, Ozzy, go ahead.
I was just wondering, what happens next, and if all goes well, when do these changes become real?
Okay, good. Awesome. You're queuing us up. Thank you so much. Josh and whoever from the city wants to discuss this, can you talk to us about that? What happens next?
Yeah, we've got some follow-up final slides to display some of that information. I can share those as far as process. As long as there's no other comments in the meantime. Yeah. But before that, we do have a list of follow-up actions, right? Before adoption, we are still tracking this list of, other items that we've heard about from previous meetings as well from new folks. The permit process fees, things like that. We still need to track those things and bring those into alignment. Doing the zoning alone may not be enough. There's always building fire code issues. We're going to track some of those. They do update the building code regularly. And so maybe get along one of those cycles and see what we can do as far as conversion of existing structures, make it a little bit simpler. Some of the public improvement triggers, we're working with Dottie and other departments to figure out what actually triggers things like an alley exaction or sidewalk improvements and see if we can reduce those costs and burdens to ADUs. And of course, we hear a lot about the water and sewer tap fees, which are outside of our jurisdiction. Denver Water, Metro Water, it's a metro district, and same with the wastewater, but those fees prove to be an issue. So we'll still track those things. These are in the strategy report as well, as you might see, but what actually happens next then is based on the feedback we've heard today, we're going to continue the engagement process. We will finalize our final strategy report, put that out for public review for an entire month. So look for that in January. We'll have that out. We'll also be doing quite a bit of public outreach, have some events in January to receive even more feedback on the final strategy, on our recommendations. After that entire process, after we receive that feedback, distill what we've heard from the public, figure out those final recommendations, things like owner occupancy. We will then begin to start to draft our proposed zoning code amendment early next year. We're looking for adoption in the spring, ideally. Is that April is when we would like to be before City Council. So we will release our zoning code amendment for committee and public review. We'll be in touch with you guys as far as when that's coming out. email it directly to you to get your eyes on it, to take a look at the draft zoning code. There'll be a review period there, but we'll start working through that adoption process. We'll have to go through, the typical legislative process of planning board, council meetings, Ludi committees, things like that, but finally adoption by city council in early spring. But we would love to have your involvement throughout the process. We will be in touch still with sending out all this content, making sure you guys do review it closely, and we're always open for comments and email to make sure we're doing exactly what we say. But we do appreciate all of the input thus far. We couldn't have done it without, all the great brains in the room. Is there anything, Abe, you would like to add about future steps?
I hope the horrible drilling noises in the background, are they horrible?
Not horrible.
Oh, good. I'm at the city office building, and I've moved rooms like 4 times. There's just some crazy thing going on. I don't know what it is. But yeah, like we really, I think, want to make sure that, we can bring you guys along for the ride, because I think it'll be a great resource for informing people of the conversation that we've had. And for example, in public hearing with planning board or city council, many of you probably don't agree with everything. And I think but the elected and appointed officials are just really interested in hearing what your experience was, what you think the things of greatest consensus were, and which things you think, are you don't support as much. And it's all really good.
Thanks. Councilwoman Black, I see your hands up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question about this timeline. Having outreach events in January, are they scheduled yet? I mean, I'm already working on my January newsletter because I'm taking the week off after Christmas. And so if you need council members to get the word out to their constituents, we need to have that information immediately. And then we had that one meeting with Councilwoman Gilmore, who was very concerned that you hadn't been out in her community. So are you doing something with her on this, or?
We're trying to figure out what we can do. And I think you're right that schedule wise, that's probably going to need to extend into February to some extent, just to make sure everyone has enough time.
Yeah, definitely good thoughts. January, February, we'll definitely be having some open houses online as well. So I think any accessible options that we can have out there. I think Councilwoman Gilmore is looking at an event in February for her area. And so, yeah, we're definitely getting those on our radar. We don't have them scheduled yet, but as soon as we do, we can certainly send it out to this group and keep everyone informed, and love for the folks that can make it to come out.
Gosha, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, thank you. This might be an obvious question to ask, but just want to put it on the table that it's going to be this city council that's going to adopt it, or that's the plan anyways, that we're not going to run into the election turnover.
Yes, exactly. That's the goal. We do want our council representatives, Councilwoman Black that's here and has attended all the committee meetings, to be there and support this package and go along with our recommendations.
Does it feel like a tight schedule to you to get it approved before May? When is April, May? When is that we have a deadline for this?
Yes, it will take some tight scheduling, but I think, yeah, we are prioritizing this project and our work products.
And the election will be in April, right? But the actual new council would not be seated until July.
That's right. Thank you. Good point. Thank you.
Thanks for bringing it up. Any other, okay, Ozzy, you have your hand up, and I just wanted to make a note for folks who are attending in the audience that we'll open this up for public comment in a few minutes. So if you do have questions, feel free to put your hand up in the, your virtual hand up, and we'll make sure to call on you. Ozzy, go ahead.
Yeah, on the previous slide about the other obstacles, I heard you verbally mention wastewater, but wastewater was not shown in the text there. That is actually a city agency. Denver runs wastewater. They charge a lot, and they have started enforcing certain rules with a great deal of strictness that make things like structure use impossible and make new ADUs much harder. So whatever comes out of this, I hope we can push on them a little bit, because they're not playing along with the ADU thing.
Yeah, it's a good distinction. Denver, Dottie does administer wastewater, but a lot of their fees are from the Metro District, and so Denver Metro Wastewater, who like actually sets the $7,000 fee, whatever it might be. Dottie does actually administer it, and so yeah, we are working with them to see where there is wiggle room, but it is still a larger Metro District that's dictating that larger fee, unfortunately. But yeah, I agree. I mean, there still is room within the confines of the city to figure out where we can make some improvements. So appreciate that.
Any other comments or questions or suggestions about actual implementation of this and next steps? Okay, great. Well, let's do this. Rosemary.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I see your hands up. Go ahead. Oh, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. I keep doing that. I just have a question about the technical review. When does that happen and how does that impact the timeline?
I think Josh is going to it. Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
Yes, good question. I mean, we do have to do quite a bit of our own internal reviews, make sure that the code language that we actually put forth is, suitable, can be administered and things like that. So we have quite a few internal review cycles. We'll begin staff working on that within the next month, January, ideally. And so we will get that out as soon as feasibly possible. That's going to take us, 2 months, I'd say, at least, to get out for the public review, but we're happy to share it as soon as we can. For public review of that, we would ideally leave like a month before adoption. And so March, ideally. What do you think, Abe? You have a better understanding of how long the technical work needs to get out?
Yeah, we're gonna start doing some drafting now, even as we continue to roll out the strategy, just to make sure we can stay on a streamlined timeline. And then, as Josh said, we have a lot of internal work to do to make sure that all the folks that administer the code are comfortable with the things that we're coming up with. And then we by general tradition, we make sure that the actual proposed code that we write is available for public comment for at least a month before we go into an adoption process. And Josh, were you still thinking also another part of technical review is we've talked about reconvening architects once we have at least the first draft of code language and giving it to them and seeing what they come up with, the good, the bad, and the ugly, which can help us fine tune things.
Yeah, that's right. We will prioritize getting it to our focus groups of architects to help test and break the code where possible.
Code breakers. Okay, any other notes, thoughts, comments on implementation? Okay. All right, well, I did want to give the members of the public who are here a chance for comment, and I see one hand up. So David Pardue, I'm going to go to you, and you should be able to make your comment or question.
Yeah, you can hear me?
Sure can.
Awesome. So first off, I just wanted to thank everybody who's been involved with this. This is really great to see all of this stuff come forward, and this all seems super workable. as somebody who's getting into this space from a development perspective. So I just wanted to thank all of you first off. The second thing really is getting a sense of exactly, to put it bluntly, when this will be implemented, and given the current 16-week backlog for residential development for permits, when we should be submitting a design or a project that would fall under the new rules, so that it will be able to be analyzed under the new rules without us waiting all the way until the new rules are implemented before we even submit, and then wait another 16 weeks.
Yep, super practical. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
that's a really good question, and something we should start working on now as well. In the past, with like zoning that affects very large projects, like building, big new mid-rise or high-rise buildings and things like that, when there's been zoning changes, we've actually been able to arrange for some review to like start kind of at risk under zoning that hasn't been adopted yet. The risk being that it actually doesn't get adopted. That may be a little bit more challenging to do here, but I think at the same time, I know that it's right at this moment, it's taking very long even to kind of get through the initial intake. So there may be a certain point in time when you've seen, as I said, like the public review of the zoning would be out there on the street. You see what the rules are, you design to it, and at risk, just go ahead and submit, a couple of months ahead of the adoption hearing, might actually make sense.
Great. Are there any other comments or questions from the audience, members of the public, before we officially close? Okay, I'm not seeing any. So I think we're ready to wrap up and close here. Josh and Abe, I guess I'd like to turn to you, Elisa, city staff, if there's anything final you want to say, and then I think we can bid everyone adieu.
No,
Go ahead, Josh.
I would just interrupt Abe really quick. I would just say thanks to everyone. Yeah, it's been a long process. I mean, it is a lot of work. It looks like at the end of the day, we've succinctly as a team got it down to a few tables and charts, and it doesn't look like all that was done, but we all know the struggles to get here and the trading and the occurring that has done its due diligence. We're happy to see the package moving forward, and so thank you all.
Yeah, when Josh has expressed concern about how this doesn't actually change that many of the words in the zoning code, I've always just said, that's not what's important. It's the impact of those words, and I think we're changing proposing to change some really important words, and so I think it's like everybody's done really great work. We're like so appreciative for this committee because you've been such a great combination of like neighborhood wisdom and technical knowledge. And that's contributed to us crafting the strategy that we think is really going to benefit ADU construction in the city. All of you have been great. Ozzy, who's so supportive of ADUs, still really just understands the need to make compromises to make it work for the city, as does Councilwoman Black, who's really helped us navigate those compromises that we need to make to, really make this a workable package for all of the city. And Renee, who continues to, she's not here right now, I don't think, but she's needling us all the time kind of off stage about every part of the process for ADUs, and that's great. She's been a huge advocate for ADUs and housing options in general across the city. And Rosemary, just making sure that we're always considering what people love about their neighborhoods and building that into our thinking. And yeah, you've all just been a really great group.
Yeah, thank you for that, everybody, and thanks for the notes in the chat. And it's such a treat to be part of a group that is just totally collaborative and you know, you all have been so respectful of one another and the different views and experiences that everyone brings. So thank you a ton. Oh, and I see one, let me see if I see one final note from an audience, from Jeff Baker in the audience. So let me go to you, Jeff, and then we're going to wrap up in about 2 minutes. You should be able to talk. Go ahead.
Thank you. And just good job, everybody. I appreciate it. And Abe and Josh, sorry, I've probably been a thorn in your side here for the last month or so, prodding you on things. And but just trying to make it so this is easier for everybody and we can do the right things and make this smoother process. So I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for being here. And with that, I think we're going to say goodnight to everyone. Once again, thank you. And I know that the city will be in touch going forward, and there's a lot of work to be done. So feel free to come off mute, say goodbye before you hop off. I see Sean clapping. Claps to all of you.
Holidays.
Thank you, everyone.
Happy holidays.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you.